are several major events going on around the world that are putting pressure on global food supplies and sending prices sharply higher. Christina Partsinovas joins us this morning to tell us about the latest on how bad it really is. How bad is it?
It's pretty bad because many have never seen food prices this high in their lifetime. In February alone, the UN's food price index soared 13% in February. That's the highest level since the index's inception back in 1990. We know Russia's invasion of Ukraine is largely to blame, but there are numerous black swan or unpredictable events plaguing your dinner plate. Let's start, for example, with hog disease. There was a hog disease outbreak that is shrinking herds in Mexico, forcing Mexico to turn to U.S. pork supplies, and that's driving prices higher. January and February alone, exports to Mexico climbed 33% year over year. And then you've got lean hog futures that have climbed over 20% just this year alone, all while farmers are shrinking herds because animals are just getting way too expensive to feed right now. And that's because you've got a surge in grain and fertilizer prices related, of course, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that have hit meat producers like Tyson Food and JBS. You got BMO and Barclays that are both holding the chicken, downgrading Tyson right now. And then you've got bird flu that's sweeping the nation, forcing American farmers to kill millions of hens and slashing the supply of eggs, driving weekly prices up 44% compared to last year. And keep in mind, the Easter holiday further adds to the demand, and that's just around the corner. You've got upswings in prices that have helped egg producers like Cal-Maine not only produce positive cash flow, but offset prior losses and allow the board to declare a dividend. And then, you feeling a little thirsty right now? The U.S. Department of Agriculture said this year's citrus crop was expected to be the smallest in more than 50 years. Frozen OJ prices were up 17% in February compared to last year. And that's because of an invasive insect disease that damaged Florida orange groves, sending OJ futures also up 16% this year. And you think these prices are bad? According to the USDA, they're warning that it's only going to get worse as some companies move on to 2 and 3 rounds of price hikes, unfortunately.
Food warehouses burned to the ground in Ukraine. Supermarket shelves empty globally. The effect of Russia's war in Ukraine isn't just affecting people in the country, but around the world. Ukraine and Russia, between them, produce 53% of the world's sunflower oil and seeds and 27% of its wheat. To put that into perspective, if current supplies of sunflower oil run out, Belgium runs out of the ability to make French fries. If wheat supplies run low, Lebanon could run out of bread along with Egypt and Tunisia, and 27 African countries could face wheat shortages. With Russia under tough sanctions and its food exports severely restricted, and the war also stopping Ukrainian exports, businesses are under pressure.
There are also crimes against Ukrainian agricultural production, different branches of the production. The biggest challenge that Ukrainian agrarians are facing is to plant the fields in time. 82,500 square kilometers of Ukrainian land is mined. This means we need much time for demining these lands.
TAS Agro is a big agribusiness in Ukraine. Its director says it will be affected if the war doesn't end soon, but it is taking action.
The situation with the war is changing constantly. However, we created so-called crisis teams and are preparing actively for sowing, which starts soon.
The war has destroyed agribusiness in the east of Ukraine, and only fields in the south and west can be planted. But even then, forecasts indicate supply and labor shortages mean only half of those fertile fields will be cultivated. In July, this wheat field will be ready for harvest. It's a crucial part of Ukraine's economy. However, will they be able to get this wheat onto a boat and out to international markets, given the situation? Russia has blocked ports on the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. About 13.5 million tons of wheat and 16 million tons of corn are sitting in the docks. Combined with the war and the sanctions against Russia, that's led to food prices rising everywhere. And the longer this conflict goes on, the higher they'll get.
It's harvest season in the soybean field in southern Brazil. The city of Prudentopolis is more than 10,000 kilometers from Ukraine, but the war seems closer than ever. Russia and Ukraine account for nearly 30% of global fertilizer exports, but the war and sanctions are hurting supply chains across the world.
The question is, from where will Brazil buy more fertilizers? We have to find other markets, but it's not that simple.
Brazil is the world's fourth largest consumer of fertilizers. Analysts warn higher prices means less production of essential crops. Farmers are also struggling in Kenya. Up until recently, fertilizing this entire farm in Nairobi cost about $175. Now, it's 5 times as much.
With the price hike, it's going to cost about $875 to cover the farm. I can't continue with this business. I'm quitting because the losses are too high.
Developing countries have been hit particularly hard by the shortage.
The number of people facing food insecurity has increased over the last year, especially after the pandemic. This comes at a bad time and just ends up exacerbating our food challenges globally.
In this street market in Athens, the effects of the war are already hurting both suppliers and consumers.
I would pay about $20 to $24 for a unit of fertilizer, but now the price is about $41, and I'm talking about fertilizers that are essential for us.
Food prices were soaring before the war. The UN says its World Food Price Index reached the highest level last month since it started keeping records in 1990. The fighting in Ukraine is intensifying the problem, putting at risk future harvests.
The war is supercharging a 3-dimensional crisis, food, energy and finance, that is pummeling some of the world's most vulnerable people, countries and economies. And all this comes at a time when developing countries are already struggling with a slate of challenges not of their making.
Russia and Ukraine produce about 30% of the world's wheat and barley. The UN says at least 36 nations, including some of the poorest, get the majority of their wheat from them. Food prices are up 34% compared to last year, the highest levels ever recorded by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Crude oil prices have risen 60% compared to last year. Russia and Belarus also exported roughly 1/5 of the world's fertilizers, and their prices have more than doubled.
Inflation affects the way Zerlina Smith members eats, shops, drives, nearly every aspect of her life.
We went from Lipton's to a store brand tea because I love it, my daughter loves it, and that's what we could afford. The inflation has us in the store where we used to can spend, say, $20 on lunch meat, bread, and cheese. The basic things have doubled. A loaf of bread is $5. Who can afford that?
Food and fuel have been especially hard hit. Pandemic-related kinks in the global supply chain and an energy shortage partly due to the war in Ukraine have driven up prices on a broad range of goods.
If you do see products on sale, which has become less pervasive than ever before, buy it, stock up, put things in the freezer because prices are not going to go down.
That's left grocery store shelves more bare and more pricey.
The Dollar Tree is the kind of store a lot of working class families come to save money. For 35 years, nearly everything in the store cost $1. Now, it's $1.25.
I'm questioning some of her.
The founder of Chicago's nonprofit Violence Interrupters program says inflation appears to be contributing also to a spike in crime.
The reason why some of the crime levels are rising is because inflation is pretty tough out here. You have people out there trying to rob Peter to pay Paul. You have the carjackings on the rise.
With the U.S. government hoping to lower gas prices by releasing oil from the nation's strategic petroleum reserve and the Federal Reserve raising interest rates to discourage borrowing, President Biden says his administration is working on it.
More and more Americans get jobs as they do. It's going to help ease the supply pressures we've seen. And that's good news for fighting inflation. It's good news for our economy, and it means that our economy has gone from being on the mend to being on the move.
For her and many Americans, each day brings less and less for them to cut.
Tim Adams in person. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. Good to see you guys.
So your group, the IIF, represents all the banks around the world.
Around the world.
And you've been traveling and talking to all of them. What is we covered Jamie Dimon at length today, but what is the current mood specifically overseas around what's happening in Russia, the sanctions, and just how much it's going to bite the global economy?
Sure, a lot of concern about growth, especially in Europe, on the eastern periphery. And then for those countries that are close to the crisis, the front, there's concerns about sanctions and what it means. I was just in Turkey, for example. They expect 4 million Russian tourists to show up in Turkey this summer. What does that mean? Will they come? Will they spend? Will they be allowed to spend? And is there a potential threat to the institutions if there are more sanctions put in place?
So as a result of all of this, what are we seeing? You guys also do a good job tracking flows, money flows, out of emerging markets, going to certain places. How has the war changed all of it?
Sure. For commodity producers, it's been great. If you're an energy producer or a food producer, you're doing well. If you're an importer of energy or commodities, you're suffering. Turkey, for example, has to import energy. Egypt has to import food. So it really is a function of where you are in the commodity production cycle.
Where does it leave China?
Well, we've seen some capital flow out of China. I think there's a lot of concern about where China's going, what decision they're going to make. And, as I've told you, Washington is poised for a tough approach to China. If China makes the wrong decisions over the next few weeks or months, we could see real action out of Washington.
That's exactly what Yellen just said. Beijing's reaction to the call for action against Russia may affect the world's willingness to embrace them further.
Indeed.
I mean, it's being characterized as a bit of a hard-edged speech in that financial diplomacy is not about flows, really, but where you are on the lines of war and peace.
Right. And Janet's not known for being a hard edge. So when she speaks, I think she means it. And I think it's a message we saw to India earlier this week, to President Modi. We're hearing it for the Chinese. I think they need to make a decision about where they are in this crisis.
Do you have any sense as to what our response might be, though, if they don't? And, again, when she says, to Carl's point, no benign interpretation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and China says, and does nothing, what do we then do?
Well, there's always secondary sanctions, which would have a huge impact on Chinese or Indian institutions. Also in Washington, there's a number of pieces of legislation sort of sitting on the sidelines, waiting to be implemented, focused on China and other countries, which would impact capital flows.
Yeah, but it would impact a lot of other things, too, wouldn't it?
Huge collateral damage.
Huge.
That's why you don't want to do it unless you absolutely have to. But I think this is clear messaging that they're willing to ratchet up if they don't see the kind of action they want.
And also on the food, the comments from Yellen on the potential food crisis, so to speak, and the vulnerabilities in the global food system. How real is that in your opinion?
It's very real. As I was just telling Sarah, I've been to eastern Ukraine. It's a breadbasket. It looks like Kansas. And once you start cordoning off 20 or 30% of the world's wheat or other kinds of barley or oat, you have real impact on prices. And it remains to be seen who's going to make up at the margin.
The problem is we just don't know where this is going. We don't know when the war is going to end. Right. We hope sooner than later. We don't know when the supply chains are coming back. Now they're getting worse with China. So in that kind of environment, how do you plan and what is the outlook?
Yeah, I think Jamie hit the nail on the head. We don't know. It's the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. But we do know with higher inflation, historic levels, supply chain still stress, China locked down, potentially hanging in the balance, and a war that in Europe that continues to go on in a protracted way. And we just saw President Putin today say he's not interested in peace. So this isn't going away anytime soon.
The Russian Ministry of Defense says this destroyed building was a Ukrainian weapons factory in the southwest outskirts of the capital, Kyiv. Moscow says the plant made anti-aircraft and anti-ship missiles. People living nearby say they heard at least 3 large explosions early Friday morning.
We parked the car and the 2 rockets hit at 1 a.m. I did not realize that there are 2 rockets coming in. But when I went out afterwards, I waited indoors for some time, fearing more shelling. We saw the 3rd one coming. It damaged the car, tore out the tires, hit the windows and walls. People suffered too. The walls fell out.
The attack came hours after Russia said its Black Sea Fleet flagship, the Moskva, had sunk while being towed back to port after a fire caused an explosion on board. The Ukrainian military said it was responsible, having targeted the vessel with Ukrainian-made Neptune missiles. People gathered at a memorial ceremony for the ship in the port city of Sevastopol in Russian-annexed Crimea. The Moskva was the largest Russian naval vessel to have sunk in action since World War II.
Even for those who have not been there, Moscow was a symbol for everyone. Symbol of our power, our hope, the revival of the fleet in the 90s. It is a symbol of engineering and scientific achievements, force of our arms.
The Ukrainian army says it repelled Russian army advances on at least 2 towns in the east of the country. Russia has redirected its forces from Kiev in an effort to seize more territory in the Donbass region. Volunteers help Ukrainian soldiers pack food to be distributed to some of the many thousands of people fleeing or those still living in the worst affected areas.
I stay here because it's my home, and we help people delivering food, chemistry, and our town just destroying. Voice not good. I don't know what to say. Okay. I want to move. Okay.
This drone footage shows destroyed residential buildings in Mariupol. The besieged port city on the Azov Sea has suffered 7 weeks of bombardment by Russian forces and pro-Russian separatists. Repeated attempts at securing humanitarian corridors to rescue thousands of people trapped inside have failed. The mayor of the city estimates thousands of civilians may have been killed in the fighting. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense says Russia has for the first time used long-range bombers to attack the city.
Russian occupants keep carrying out aerial strikes on Mariupol. They use long-range bombers. The enemy's land forces are trying to capture the seaport.
The strike on what the Russian Defense Ministry describes as a weapons factory on the outskirts of Kiev is the first major strike by Russian forces on a target around the capital city since Russian forces left the area more than 2 weeks ago. Major military operations now, for the time being, have moved east, where there are increasing reports of an effort by the Russian military to close in around the strategically important city of Slavyansk. The UN says that more than 4.7 million people have fled the fighting, and with no indication of any de-escalation, that number is expected to rise.
Tanks, helicopters, personnel carriers, tens of millions of dollars worth of equipment, all destroyed. And these are just a small portion of the losses suffered by one of the most powerful armies in the world. When Russia began its offensive, it hoped to capture Ukraine's capital Kiev within days. But Ukraine's army withstood the assault.
Evidently, the Russian army has endemic problems with morale, with its equipment, with its training and its doctrine. And as a result, Rasul, to answer your question directly, Russia has been defeated in the field to a point where it was effectively routed from the north of the country.
Ukrainian armed forces have taken advantage, often ambushing Russian troops and columns. In less than 2 months since Russia invaded Ukraine, its military has lost thousands of soldiers. According to Ukrainian officials, it's more than the United States did in its 20 years of war in Afghanistan and nearly a decade in Iraq combined. They say Russia has lost at least 479 tanks, 496 infantry fighting vehicles, 20 aircrafts, 4 ships, 32 helicopters, 784 trucks, vehicles, and jeeps. In total, the Russians have lost nearly 3,000 pieces of equipment. And these are considered conservative estimates. The highest profile loss to date was the Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet.
Losing a flagship during a war is, well, really bad. It's a bad PR. It's bad. It's going to expand, increase the morale of the Ukrainians at the time when they are on the verge of losing Mariupol.
While many things can be said to have gone wrong for Russians, General Valery says the Ukrainian armed forces had a secret weapon.
The mobilization of our society and people's resistance. Our pilots, who are older than 60 years old, come out and ask for jets. They retired from the armed forces a long time ago and asked, "Give us planes and we will destroy the Russians." So morale is our formula for success.
Ukrainian forces have employed new tactical weapons given to Ukraine by NATO allies. Chief among them are portable anti-tank guided missile systems such as the US-made Javelin and its lighter, cheaper cousin Anlo, which have been used against Russian tanks with devastating effect. In the air, the Turkish-made 2B2 Bayraktar drones have carried out both reconnaissance and strike operations. Portable Stinger anti-aircraft missiles have also enabled Ukrainian soldiers to take out low-flying aircraft. As tactical miscalculations, misjudgment of the Ukrainian resistance, and low morale have all contributed to Russian military vulnerability in this war, these weapons are leveling the playing field.
Tuesday morning in Steglitz, and for Larissa and her children it's time for breakfast. As Ukrainian refugees, they're currently living with a host family. The transition from war zone to Berlin suburb was initially hard. But already her children are learning German, and Larissa says she feels this country has been very welcoming.
The government has been very supportive. They've given us money, health insurance. They've helped us a lot. We don't feel like refugees. We have the same rights as Germans. It's helped to make us feel like we have a second home here.
In the nearly 2 months since the war began, many millions of people have fled Ukraine. Fewer than 1 in 10 of them has come to Germany, making the sort of journey that millions of other refugees made in the last decade, when the people getting off trains in the big cities were mostly Syrian. Although the then German government said it could cope with their arrival, there were many problems.
Once they arrived, the first thing was that they had to stay in mass accommodation for the reception in the reception center. And that could last months, sometimes years, before they found their own housing. So that was a huge challenge. The second is when they come with a family, kids, they have to go to school. So integrating them into school, learning the language, learning the German way of the school system.
Although the situation for refugees here is better now, that experience has etched itself onto the collective memory and forced politicians to change policy.
Die neue Bundesregierung ermöglicht.
The new government has offered support on a large scale to the federal states. This has allowed us to give refugees better opportunities for integration. This is a clear message. We're doing it better, we're doing it differently, and we've learned from the mistakes of the past.
There is another important difference between then and now. Ukrainians have the right to visa-free travel across much of the EU. Syrians do not.
Which helps to explain why most of the Ukrainian refugees in Europe have not come to Germany, whereas most of the Syrians did. So when ministers say that they are dealing with the problems now better, that might in part be because the need for resources is being tested far less than it was back then.
The governor of Florida chose an evangelical church in the city of Kissimmee to sign the state's 15-week abortion ban into law. Currently, Florida allows women to have abortions within the first 24 weeks of pregnancy. The new law comes into force on July the 1st.
The bill today will provide protections for unborn children from abortion when the child reaches 15 weeks of gestational age. Of course, these are babies that have heartbeats and that can feel pain and can move, as we said.
There are some exceptions on health grounds, but no exception for rape or incest. Abortion rights activists say the law disproportionately affects the most vulnerable.
People with the fewest resources who cannot afford to travel out of state for time-sensitive, essential health care are forced to carry pregnancies and go through childbirth against their will. The consequences are devastating.
Several conservative states have recently joined a growing push for abortion restrictions. Oklahoma's governor has signed a near-total ban. The only exception is a medical emergency. Kentucky has also all but banned the procedure. New restrictions are expected to force the state's 2 remaining abortion providers to close. Texas outlawed abortions after 6 weeks. Last month, a woman was arrested for murder after being reported for an alleged self-induced abortion, though the charges were dropped. Anti-abortion activists are awaiting a Supreme Court ruling on Mississippi's abortion ban. Pro-choice campaigners fear the court, stacked with conservative justices, may be ready to overturn Roe v. Wade, the decision that protects federal abortion rights.
The Secretary for the agency...
Access to abortions has long been a divisive and deeply political issue in the US, but momentum seems to be gathering pace to challenge the choice of women across the country.
Jabulani Mkhize sits alongside the body of his 19-year-old daughter. Her body was discovered after she was washed away by floodwaters in Inanda, outside the port city of Durban. They still haven't found her sister, who's been missing for 2 days.
What happened to our family is devastating. I've lost 2 of my daughters. My other daughter and wife are in hospital, and the worst part is that we have not received any help from the government. The only help we have is from the community.
Zandile Makubane is leading the search for missing people after heavy rain and mudslides devastated this region of South Africa. As they walk through the steep hills that force the torrents of water through the village, she says this is where the first body was found. At least 5 other people from this community are missing. Throughout Inanda, the destruction only worsens. Roads and bridges have collapsed, cutting off people from main roads. There's no electricity or running water. Here, at least 4 homes have been reduced to rubble.
We heard people shouting. My brother and father tried to rescue them, but by then the houses were covered by water and the tree collapsed on the houses. We don't know what happened to them.
People here say they can't do much to find those who are missing. While President Cyril Ramaphosa has visited some of the flood-stricken areas and offered government support, this community says there's not been any so far. Informal settlements have been severely affected by the heavy rain and flooding. While the rain has slowed for now, it's expected to get worse. People who escaped the first wave of flooding are worried they'll not be as fortunate in the coming days.
We are following a government emergency team that's been in the village of Cantagnos for nearly a week. Hundreds of families once lived here, but a major landslide reduced a once thriving community to rubble. Their work has been difficult for days. They have retrieved bodies on the outskirts of the village and are slowly digging for more. Cantagnos is just one of the many areas devastated by Tropical Storm Meggy earlier this week. But the scale of the death and damage has shocked many, and the province is still reeling from the effects of another typhoon 4 months ago. President Rodrigo Duterte arrived in Leyte late on Friday. He visited hospitals full of rescued civilians. The smell of decaying bodies is quite overwhelming. Just behind me is a neighborhood that rescuers took several days to access. It may seem close from where we are, but they actually had to go around and secure the perimeter in order to reach that area. Now, the focus of responders now have gone from rescue to retrieval. In the town of Bunga, Marites Martinez lost 16 members of her family. It took several days before their bodies were retrieved.
I still feel as if they're here, that they're still alive. It's quite a shock.
Molito Etable also lost his daughter and 2 grandchildren.
It hurts. My chest hurts. I just spoke to them the day before.
The Martinez family has set up this tent, and just like hundreds of others here, they are in desperate need of aid.